Today I'm going to take you along as I overhaul these garage doors and bring them some new life with the help of today's sponsored 3M Scotch brand painter's tape. Regardless of what you're painting, whether it's indoor or out, Scotch has you covered with a painter's tape for nearly every application. Find out which Scotch painter's tape is right for your application by visiting their website at scotchblue.com. Now let's dive into it. These doors have seen some better days. A lot of the work that was done to these doors originally was not done very well, and the paint is peeling. The weather stripping was never done correctly, so it's actually in some pieces that are beginning to peel off. There's gaps where the brick meets the boards. The weather stripping on the underside of the door is all dry rot and destroyed, so there's actually water that pools up anytime that we get a heavy rain. So there's a lot of things to fix. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull off some of this old weather stripping and get rid of some of the junk we're not going to need anymore. And then I can go in and clean up the old caulk, get rid of it. And that way I can prep and get some new caulk in there and get everything sealed up nice. I added some screws into the framing anywhere that it was kind of pulled away from the wall and used some backer rod in some of the larger gaps so that I could use some paintable caulk and seal everything to the brick. If you watch some of my other videos, you know we're changing the color scheme of the house, and we're going to go with a little bit more of a bold color to add some curb appeal to both the garage walk-in door and to the garage doors themselves. The entry door is not in great shape. There's quite a few runs and drips and things on it, so I decided to sand it down a little bit and add a coat of primer on top of it, and I'll also be replacing the weather stripping on the bottom of it because that's in bad shape as well. So while the primer dries, I'm going to shift gears and focus on the trim around the doors. Now obviously the brick is kind of a rough texture, and it can be challenging to paint somewhere where brick meets wood, and that's where I'm using Scotch rough surface painter's tape. It's specifically designed to adhere to rough surfaces like this brick, and it will allow me to get a nice clean line as I paint between the trim and the brick. Now the other thing to deal with on the entry door is that there's weather stripping on the inside of the door as well. If the weather stripping's damaged or you're planning to replace it, then you can just remove it and replace it later. But maybe there's nothing wrong with it, you want to protect it, and in that case I'd recommend using the Scotch Delicate Surface Painter's Tape. It's designed for delicate surfaces like this weather stripping so that you can protect it from getting paint on it, but it's not going to stick to it and potentially tear it when you pull it off later. And what's really nice with the rough surface painter's tape is that you can actually leave it on for up to 5 days inside and 3 days outside and still get clean removal without leaving behind any damage or sticky residue. Now I'm electing to paint all the trim around the doors first. Some people would paint the doors first. I just have always painted the lighter of the two colors first. I mentioned that in a previous video, and it's just kind of the way that I work. If you make a mistake, it's easier to cover up a lighter paint with a darker paint, so have the lighter paint on first. That's at least always been my thought process. So I did 2 coats of the light tan on all the trim boards, and then I could shift focus to the other color. As I mentioned at the beginning, I had to replace the weather stripping, and there's 2 ways that you could kind of paint the weather stripping. And I did one of each. The one way is that you can install the weather stripping and then use some Scotch Sharp Lines painter's tape between the framing and the weather stripping if you're painting it a different color, like I am. And you can leave the Sharp Lines tape in place for 21 days either inside or outside and still get a clean removal. Or the other option is to paint the weather stripping before you install it, and then just do some touch-up paint over whatever galvanized fasteners that you're using to attach it. Now when it comes to painting the doors themselves, normally I would want to use some Scotch Sharp Lines painter's tape all along the bottom here and make sure I don't get any paint on this rubber weather stripping, but this weather stripping is totally shot, so I'm not worried about it. I'm going to be replacing it, so I'm not going to tape it off. But I am going to use the Scotch Sharp Lines painter's tape for the windows that are built into the door. So I'm going to mask off all the windows because I'm going to do a 2-tone color scheme here as well. The tan trim color will be around the window frames, and then the doors will be a different color. You can really tell how poor and blotchy this paint job was when you throw on some polarized lenses. It looks terrible. Now normally I would use a paint sprayer to paint doors like this, but I know that since this is a DIY job, somebody in the comments is going to say, "It's not a DIY job if you have an expensive paint sprayer, duh." So I'm going to show you that it's possible to get a good finish just using a brush and a roller. It can be a bit more challenging to do this way, but it's certainly possible. Especially when you have paneled doors like this, you have to kind of change direction a bunch, make sure you get paint all inside the different panels and things like that. The thing to keep in mind is that I always focus on the inner part of the door first, meaning not the edges, and there's a reason for that. Especially in a drier climate like this where the paint can set up quickly, which can be in a matter of minutes here, you want to make sure that you don't paint the weather stripping to the door. If you paint the weather weather stripping and the door at the same time and the paint dries, the next time you go to open the door, you could actually peel some paint off, or you could actually damage the door itself, depending on how stuck it is. So paint the sides of the door closest to the weather stripping last, and then make sure that you open the door within a few minutes after you finish painting it. That way it won't set up and you don't have paint that dries between the two. The other thing to keep in mind is that you never want to paint behind the weather stripping on either the weather stripping or the door itself, because the paint could cause some friction, cause problems with the door opening and closing, and it's a big headache you don't want to deal with. So I'm doing 2 coats of paint to help get a nice even finish on all the doors, and that takes me well into the night. And then the next day I can just focus on any touch-ups and getting these things weather tight. I gave it the polarized lens test to make sure that everything was nice and even. And to finish up the weatherproofing and hopefully stop the water from coming in, I'm starting by replacing the weather stripping on the underside of the doors. Now, this is typically a task that is a little bit easier if you have a second set of hands, but the gist of it is that you want to remove the old rubber weather stripping. And then after I make sure that the track is nice and clean, I like to use a little white lithium grease to spray inside the underside of the track. And that allows me to slide in the new weather stripping a little bit easier, especially if I'm doing it by myself. There are some variations in the profiles of weather stripping, so you just got to make sure that you get the right weather stripping style for the underside of your door, and also make sure to leave it just slightly longer than the width of your track, so that way if it slides around at all in the door, you won't have any gaps where water can get in. And unfortunately, whoever graded this graded it backwards so that any water that's outside the door actually slopes inward instead of outwards. I'm adding 1 extra layer of waterproofing, and that's a rubber threshold along the bottom to hopefully create a pretty impenetrable layer of waterproofing that will hopefully keep all the water out. And to do that, I'm just cleaning the concrete really well so that I have a nice clean surface. And then I line up the rubber with the door, making sure I have it exactly where I want it. And then I'm using some Scotch heavy duty painter's tape along the edges of it, which does 2 things. 1, it marks the position of where the rubber needs to go so I can apply the adhesive in the right spot. And 2, if any of the sticky adhesive gets spread out from underneath when it gets pressed down, it ends up on the tape, which I can then peel up quickly, and it'll still leave a nice clean line, and I won't have a bunch of sticky adhesive sticking out from underneath. And lastly, I'm experimenting with this kind of magnetic faux hardware to see if I like it and see if I like the placement of it, see if we think it's going to be a good accent along with everything else that we're doing. And I do kind of like it, but we'll see as the rest of this side comes together. And obviously I've still got a bunch more painting to do to get everything put together, but for now, these garage doors are completely overhauled and I feel really good about them. So thanks for watching this video. I want to say thank you again to the Scotch brand for making this video possible, and encourage you guys to check out scotchblue.com to figure out which painter's tape are right for your application. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.